Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. A charity law report found that in 2023, 67% of all revenue going to Canadian charities comes from government. So a potential change in government with new policies and mandates can cause significant uncertainty among many nonprofits about their future revenue streams, and even anxiety. Federally, the Liberal minority government has already faced multiple non-confidence votes in Parliament, and more are expected. So a snap election could happen at any time in the months prior to the required election in the fall of 2025. Provincially, the Ontario government is expected to call an election perhaps in the next 6 months, while BC and New Brunswick have just gone through elections that signal a major shift in political support in those provinces. And Saskatchewan is in the middle of an election as we record this interview. In the face of such uncertainty, what can Canadian nonprofits do to better prepare their organizations for a potential new government? Are there any steps that they can take to insulate their operations and revenue streams from the turbulence of government uncertainty? To discuss these important issues, we're joined by Kathryn Babcock, CEO of capitalW, a consulting agency focused on fundraising strategy and execution, and informed by revenue data on every charity in Canada. Kathryn is a seasoned specialist in resourcing collective impact, complexity, and systems change, with over 25 years' experience at the community and national level. Welcome to the podcast, Kathryn.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wonder if you could give context in how much that charities and nonprofits actually rely on government funding in Canada. Do we have research available on this?
We do. So it's a great starting point in terms of framing the whole conversation around insulation and revenue in the midst of potential disturbances. So $322 billion flows through the charitable sector every year to charities. And 239 billion of that is from government at different levels. So that is 77% of money that is flowing to charities is from government, either federal, provincial, or municipal. And actually, federal is only around 7%. The majority is provincial, and with a small fraction coming from municipality. And the reason the majority is provincial is because of the jurisdictional issues. And there's a lot of federal transfer payments to the provinces. So the money might have originated with the feds, but from the charities' perspective, when they're recording where the money's coming from, the lion's share is coming from the province in which they reside.
That's so interesting. So the numbers that I talked about at the top of this are, don't tell the whole picture, obviously.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when I originally did the whole, we have 5 years of data on the finances of the charities in Canada. I was somebody who had, spent my career working in the charitable sector, and I had this notion that there were 86,000 charities in the country. And I really didn't pay much attention to it because I was a fundraiser really focused on the organization that I was in. And I think to be a good fundraiser, you need to believe whatever it is you're doing is the best. So I didn't really have a lot of visibility perhaps to what other groups were doing. And so when I went into the data science space to really understand what is the baseline capitalization of the charitable sector as a whole, the discovery for me that although technically there are 86,000 charities, there are more than 6,000 aren't active. So we're down to 79,000. And then 6,000 are private foundations. And again, I felt silly that I didn't know that private foundations were charities. Because I just thought it said private. And then public foundations are another 4,000. And then you have charitable organizations that are 68,000, but of those, like 20,000 are churches and mosques. And so by the time you actually unpack to kind of what perhaps the person on the street thinks of as a charity, like a food bank or a women's shelter, or there's less than 20,000. And so it's just fascinating, even that bit of information in terms of conceptualizing the sector as a whole, and then understanding that 77% of it is coming from government, and also recognizing that the majority of players in this, people who work in the sector, are women. I came to the very brief conclusion that it should be mostly women talking mostly to government. So that's the majorities on both sides. But that, so even the frame about like reliance on government suggests that there shouldn't be a reliance on government. And I think that this is something that was, unpacked in terms of looking at all of this. This is the largest public-private partnership that we have in Canada, is the charitable sector. And that's not even getting into the nonprofits that aren't registered charities, right? The only difference, of course, is charities can issue charitable tax receipts, and nonprofits cannot. But the concept that charities should be able to function without government dollars, I think, mischaracterizes the partnership. So there are a lot of charities doing work that government is outsourcing to them through contributions, which government would have to do themselves, provide themselves as part of their mandate if those charities were not providing those pieces. So I don't know that it's ever that a charity is completely independent of government, but more that if you have more private resourcing or non-governmental resourcing, it can enhance the comfort level of government in terms of resourcing your work. But if we look at where money's coming from the sector, in terms of like the 77% of the revenues are coming from government, 6% get charitable tax receipts. 6% of the dollars in the charitable sector get tax receipts. So there's tons of focus on philanthropy and philanthropic resources, but there is no chance, even if they tripled the amount that they were giving and they were up to 18%, that would ever take the space of government resourcing. But that small percentage can leverage and build a resiliency in terms of engaging with government. And depending on the kind of organization, it can be entirely philanthropic, but those are rare. And the outside of the ballot box, philanthropy is the most significant vote for the kind of Canada that we want to live in. And I think governments pay attention to those votes in terms of when they are understanding, or at least you're stronger for having those votes in terms of reflecting a priority of the society. And that includes volunteer capital, intellectual capital, voluntary capital, and financial capital. But it's really powerful. It's a powerful vote. And in conceptualizing how the whole system works, the desire is that we can be more intentional about how we're putting our voluntary contributions towards the kind of Canada that we want to live in.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the government actually is taking signals from philanthropy about the kind of policies that would be of interest or attractive or what people care about among the electorate. Is that what I'm understanding you to have just said?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it so dramatically. It's more kind of hinting at something in terms of like governments in Canada every year spend about $980 billion. And that's in terms of non-voluntary contributions, our taxes. And of those, 500 billion, so more than half, is for the health and social protection of Canadians. So we're already aligned. We already have a social contract as Canadians that we do non-voluntary contributions towards the social contract that we have with each other. It's that the private dollars have an outsized outsized indication to government, especially for new initiatives, right? So we were involved in fundraising for an initiative where there wasn't a government grant available for it. But because we had raised $3 million from the private sector, it was a new initiative, $3 million from the private sector, we could go to government and find resourcing outside of their normal granting processes because it was an opportunity to bring government to a table, as opposed to government giving resourcing and hoping that people can find matches. We're like, no, we got Bay Street, join us. And that allows a leverage that gives a sense of confidence that there's something happening here. Or if you have a constituency that really cares about what you're doing, to activate that, whether it's volunteers or donors, as a mechanism to fortify that these organizations are not expendable, and that there's a constituency that's built around it. So it just makes the organization stronger. I mean, governments have very clear policy objectives. We are putting literally hundreds of millions of dollars every year as Canadians through our tax system towards those things. It's just that private philanthropy, when people make a choice that is not obligated, it has a stature that is a vote for that issue or that client, that service that it provides. And one of the pieces around kind of resilience is being able to demonstrate to local like local MPs or MPPs or whatever about the support in the organization for the organization in that community. I wouldn't want to characterize it as though there was the wealthy charities. The government would see them as more important. It's just private philanthropy has an outsized role to play, and to the extent that that can be cultivated, it puts an organization in a stronger position. And also any kind of revenue diversification gives confidence. So I remember working with an organization that had had a single government grant that was on the decline, and we went in and helped them generate enough operating dollars so they could be independent of government for their operations, and them not relying on government funding in that way, because they weren't a service organization, they were a national entity. Not relying on government made the government more comfortable in terms of offering them grants. And they're now receiving many multiples of that in terms of government funding, but they've never lost their ability to cover their operations from private sources. Even though it's a small amount relative to their overall budget, it's important independence that allows for players to come to the table without feeling like the organization's resting on their shoulders, except as it relates to contributions. So grants are one thing. When you're applying to a grant, contributions are, as we know, like the heads and beds, like you're providing a service and governments need to support it because you're providing a service that they would have to provide. It's a different scenario there, but any way that you can have lots of revenue diversification just makes you stronger in whatever interface that you have with government.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's not that you can necessarily influence policy of government by having private sources of revenues or support, but what it does do is sort of add credibility that this is a meaningful cause that has attracted a lot of support, and that I guess it's a safer bet in the sense that you are actually providing funds to one that is clearly attracting other kinds of financial support privately and among individuals, presumably as well. And that's why the government should consider providing additional funding. That's a way of kind of building resilience? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So for an organization to build resilience in terms of their fundraising, there's about 5 different ways that money can move to a charity or nonprofit, and one of those ways is government grants. But the other ways are, if you can have an earned revenue strategy, or if you can have an annual giving program, or if you can have a major gifts program, or if you have revenues coming in from other places, it allows you to kind of to be a little bit more resilient in the face of potential funding withdrawals. But it also creates the opportunity to approach government with conceptualizations, because you have resources to bring to the table. So anywhere where you can bring resources to the table, you're in a more, I don't know, it's a powerful position. Because right now the orientation to government I've heard someone describe it as a parasitic supplicants, right? Like you're really lucky if you get their funding, and I just like the turn of it to say, no, actually, government's lucky to be at your table, and to be able to move these resources together with you, um, and if you have private donors, just like when you go into a major gift ask, you bring your volunteers, because they don't have to be there, but they care, and that matters tons. You don't take your paid staff to go in and make the ask. You bring the volunteers. And so similarly with philanthropy, it's like people are giving of themselves. They don't have to, even though there's a tax incentive to do so. They would be better off if they didn't make the contribution financially. And so that they're doing this, like they're giving of themselves, it matters. It's not a linear, like it means exactly this or it means that, but it matters. And in the conversations, I think that's a consideration.
So in the strategy, then again, it's that having other than government funding as part of your strategy serves a dual purpose. Basically, it provides you with a bit more resilience. Should government funding be withdrawn or reduced, God forbid, but it also actually does a secondary, supplementary um, uh, advantage in the sense of it providing a sense of credibility for the government to pay attention and understand that others also believe that this is an important cause that is worth investing in. Am I getting this?
Yeah, and I hesitate to say this in a way, but my experience is that if there is an endorsement from Bay Street, it elevates the charitable player, and I hate to say that, but that's been true in my experience. So it's like, because there can be this sense of like, we're lucky to get the government dollars and we're competing against each other for the government dollars, and there can feel a sense, a dynamic, and whether I'm sure it's not intended, but a sense of like, you're competing and auditioning and trying to get the money. If another sector comes in and gives it a stamp of approval, it's like, oh, it just gives you a little bit more positioning, right?
Yeah, it's a differentiation in the competition, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which I don't like, because very few charities have the capacity to go and get CEO endorsements or large corporate gifts. In the sector, 78% of charities have less than $1 million in revenue. And one of the reasons that I created capitalW was to bring the kind of fundraising that's done in the big shops, where they, in the hospitals and universities, where they can raise $100 million a year. But if you're raising $100 million a year, you're spending 10 million, right? So that's a lot of fundraisers. It's a lot of expertise, right?
Yeah. So you're excuse me. You're saying that for every 100 million, you're spending 10% on actual
Yeah,
fundraising
which is a
resources.
great
Is that right?
ratio. It is a fantastic ratio. If you're only spending 10% on fundraising, that's fantastic. So I'm just using that as a notional. Uh, but the small charities who are project funded or they don't have any, it's hard for them to get onto the scaffolding, right? Because once can invest 100,000, even, you'll soon be at the $1 million, and then you can scaffold, but there's no natural mechanism to resource that first piece of work. And so I've been working on strategies to kind of bring fundraisers that come from the discipline and the science of that space to into the community organizations, um, and all, in addition to community organizations not having the fundraising, they're also, like, in the hospitals and universities, they have special foundations that are established just to raise funds on their behalf. That's what they do. They raise funds. They don't, raise funds and actually do the work. They raise funds. So they're machines, and they're awesome, and they are best in class. But when you can spend $1 million on direct mail, and 78% of charities have less than $1 million a year in revenue, there's just different quantums. I mean, everyone calls it fundraising, but it's an entirely lopsided system. And what we see in the sector is what is true, more broadly, is that small percentage of charities receive the overwhelming majority of the resources because they're fit for purpose to have them. And also in universities and hospitals, you have alumni, right, or former patients, whereas community and social service organization or arts organizations, you don't have the same natural consistent constituency.
So if to your point, I mean, starting Capital W was to sort of bring this expertise from the big players to the smaller organizations, to support them in their fundraising strategies. Can you talk about a little bit about your research and the data tool and how that can help in providing those data points that will be important for assisting these smaller organizations, I guess, build resilience and diversify their revenue streams?
Mm-hmm. So what the data allows us to see are what the current state is, and where the revenue is, so that we can sort of benchmark charities in terms of where other people that are working in their field, how they're resourced, and how their whole sector is vis-a-vis other sectors. And so we're able to find similar organizations that have a higher percentage from earned revenue, for example. So there might be lessons there that we can apply in terms of working with another group. Or there might be certain approaches and revenue mix in others. Because the data that we have is based on the one form that every charity in the country has to fill out. So the only mandatory filing for charities, in fact, people have said it's the only thing that charities have in common, is that someone has to fill out this form, has 15 million data points on the charitable sector. And it is invaluable to be able to understand even the conceptualization that the vast majority of charities are small. How can we think about fundraising? How can we think about combining efforts? How can we think about efficiencies? How can we support a particular organization to increase their revenue, but to do it also in a way with other organizations that are in similar circumstances, right? Around finding effectiveness, particularly when there's potential sort of volatility and resourcing that may may change, to be able to work in networks or to identify economies of scale amongst similar organizations or even mergers. We've been involved in a couple of mergers of people coming together and just finding their own efficiencies, and not having those found for them, if you will. So the data allows us to understand ourselves as charities. Like, when we talk about the 86,000 charities, if we can know ourselves better as a group, then we can act in our interest as opposed to as solitary players. So the data allows us to understand each organization's in context and learn from best practice from what other players are doing. But we're starting to really work with collective impact sustainability and really looking at the cause and how to support those pieces as a way of bringing organizations together. Because when you're in an organization, and this is certainly my experience, everything was about the vitality of that organization, because that was my job. And it was my passion, and everyone has that, and that's fine. That's how organizations operate. And I think our collective protection comes from collaboration.
So I guess that is one of the methods of building greater resilience, and in fact, kind of being able to weather these storms that come from changes in government. I wonder if we could take a step back and go back to the question of, in your experience, both working as you do now uh, as a consultant in fundraising strategy and execution, as well as your experience working within nonprofits and charities. How does a change in government impact the organization, specifically when it comes to government funding, especially for those perhaps smaller ones who rely on it significantly? What kind of challenges do they face, and are there opportunities that sometimes emerge when there's a change in government, and how do they address that? What advice do you have?
It's a great question. So again, the one of the things that has come out of historic changes in government um, is the imperative of networks, right? So I believe the ONN was created out of one such crisis in terms of a change in government. So there's two ways that I see. One is that if you are a small charity that is reliant on um, grants or contributions, right? Because the contributions are you providing a service, a homeless shelter? Then it's really going to be about the fee for service and negotiating that piece. The other around kind of grants in terms of like what the priorities of government are going to be for charities. Um, I think that charities are exceptionally good because they've been having to do this for a very long time. That whatever the criteria is, um, suddenly that's what they're doing. if if the governments, and again, governments are spending, of all stripes, have spent five more than half of all of the resources around health and social protection. So there is a shared alignment, that the grant part in terms of what their priorities are is to pay attention to the framing. So I recall that in the area of gender-based violence, that a repositioning to be about safety of women and children as opposed to being about gender equality was more resonant with one stripe versus another. So there's positioning, um, and and positioning sometimes is not enough if there's if there's an agenda that's particularly antagonistic towards what your particular charity is wanting to do. But that's where the opportunities can come from private players in terms of our funding is going to be cut. We're going to cease to exist. It creates the urgency around resourcing. And every crisis presents an opportunity. And so if you're currently receiving government resourcing, is to really solidify those relationships with the bureaucrats and really get to multi-party, to let people know in your community about what your organization is doing. Build allies with your MP or MPP, have some connection so that should you need to involve them, that you're able to do so. And also to start to think, because the platforms, when they're released, there are ways and ways to start to think about and reframing, even before an election is held. But I think the recognition that for the sector, 77% of our dollars are coming from government, I think might build more of a practice in GR on behalf of charities. And that can be something that people can group together on in terms of having representation, because the Bay Street has those, of course, and the larger players have been doing risk mitigation and looking at platforms and having these relationships, and they can outsource that. They can hire people to do that, and less so with the nonprofit, but in a way the nonprofits are more vulnerable. So that's back to that piece of, like, from my observation when I was at the Canadian Women's Foundation, is that often the organizations that are serving the most vulnerable are themselves the most vulnerable. And so it's that, how do you mitigate, how do you enable those charities to thrive, because they're in the business of helping people thrive? And how do we understand that? So for me, even in helping the small charity, I go large, of saying, look, what is our social contract? What we're putting, $500 billion plus into the protection and health of Canadians, and charities are instrumental in terms of providing that. They're part of the fabric. Just in the Greater Toronto region, there's 37,000 charities and nonprofits. Like, it's a massive part of the tapestry. And so how are we part of this bigger contract? How are we taking voluntary contributions and adding them to all the non-voluntary contributions that are actually delivering the bulk of the sector? So I don't think it's realistic that a small shelter, for example, if the government decided not to provide them contributions, they wouldn't be able to replicate their $2 million a year budget by, corporate sponsorship or anything like that, because it's a government imperative around the safety of its citizens, right? They shouldn't be. It shouldn't be something that's privately, because we have a social contract around the safety of Canadian citizens. And so every situation is different, but I think it helps to look at it as a whole, to say, what are we doing? How's it going? And just to see how we have this, like, beautiful public-private partnership that's often not kind of viewed in that way.
And so where that smaller organization fits into the bigger picture in order to tell the story, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I keep coming back to this really fascinating piece that you're mentioning, is that this it's not just about diversifying your income by going after voluntary dollars from private sector or corporate sector, or even donations to provide diversity of your revenue streams for some sort of insurance purposes, to ride out storms, but it also makes you more attractive as a potential recipient of government funds. And to me, that's really an interesting sort of perspective to take, because I think a lot of the smaller charities are so focused on that next grant or that next application um, that they don't see that bigger picture. Am I correct? Is that
Right, but they also don't have the money to spend to procure, like, to get private donations. Private donations don't fall out of the sky. They are cultivated. I mean, maybe they do. I don't want to limit anybody, but but they require a disciplined investment in fundraising. And there's no natural way for community organizations to have the resources to be able to hire fundraisers because they are, project, a lot of project based, etc. So there's not that. So it's a catch 22. So it's so the bigger shops have the ability to retain the fundraisers that can, et cetera, and build them. And so the smaller organizations have different challenges. So while it could be that they'd be more attractive to government, and I'm not talking about the contributions part because that's really about basic, like, human requirements, but like the grants, they always ask in the grants, who else is funding this, right? And if you don't have anybody else, there's a risk proposition. So governments in the grant side like to see that something is sustainable, right? And so, but how do you demonstrate sustainability if you don't have revenue experts in your stable, right? Unfortunately, the ask of sustainability, because funders don't want to be your exclusive, for a grant, they don't want to be the exclusive, and or you to be reliant on them. But there's no natural mechanism, like there's no money to have a different outcome, right? So what I would like to see and what I'm working on is for funders to, if for funders who want charities to be sustainable beyond their grants, they need to embed resources for that organization to be able to hire revenue strategists and fundraisers that can ensure the financial sustainability after the lifetime of that grant. In the absence of that, it's a kind of a fairy tale that everyone hopes is true, and at the end of the grant, it's like, oh, oh, okay, let's find another grant. So
and so I guess how do you create a mechanism for that? Do you lobby these entities, these foundations, for example, how do you see it being part of a collaborative effort among smaller charities in order to bring in the kind of fundraising expertise and the revenue that's required to pay for that in order to make that possible?
yeah, so increasingly there's interest in funders around the sustainability of their grantees because they're giving grants because they really care about the organization, they really care about the issue, um, and so there's an increasing appetite to have those conversations about how can this be done differently or how can we reconsider sustainability, but they're very early conversations. One model that I'm working on, because we know that if you put in a revenue strategist and then a fundraiser, so the revenue strategist figures out of all the 6 ways that money can come, what's the most elegant route to the most resourcing, and then the fundraiser can execute against that. So because we know that if you have a revenue strategist and you have fundraising, that it is going to 10x itself within 5 years. If you can sustain that amount of investment each year, you will have a 10x return. That creating a pooled fund for foundations to contribute, if they all have a cause that they're interested in, to contribute to something that will pay for the revenue strategy and the fundraising that will enable the cause or the organization to move forward. So we're in early conversations with some funders about that piece because it helps solve their sustainability stress, and it acknowledges that there's a missing link in the system, which is um, people that know how to go and get that revenue. And and the people that know how to go and get that kind of revenue typically are not people that are great on the front lines. Um, there's a lot of expectation in terms of the earned revenue space that somebody who's a master's in social work and can deal with traumatized humans and help restore them also can be an entrepreneur off the side of their desk. It's like my my counter to that is I'd like to see entrepreneurs trying to uh, run a women's shelter per day. See how that goes. So meaning we all have our lanes, right? We all have things that are very, and the large shops that bring in a lot can bring in the $100 million a year, 50 million, or 300 million a year. They are fit for purpose. They have a lot of investment, very professional, extraordinary fundraisers. And so I'm working on creating models and mechanisms to be able to move that in, because when at Capital W we see an organization moving from 400,000 to $1 million for the first time in their history, they haven't struggled with resourcing. It is so gratifying, and we were able to do that because a donor had given an unrestricted gift to help the organization grow. And those are rare at the moment, but I think as we do more of this demonstration and more of these case studies about an investment in the private sector, you invest in intellectual capital and the financial capital follows. And there's a lot of pressure on charities, small charities without alumni, without patients. They have no lists. They, a lot of their alumni are very poor, which reminds me of my favorite fundraising story of all time, if you will indulge me. Is I met the woman who raises money for the Harvard Theology School. And she says their alumni are hopeless because they've all taken vows of poverty. so, so literally, she told me their strategy is to go to the alumni on Wall Street whom they deemed have sold their soul in some way and have them donate to the theology school. Whatever works, right?
Right.
But social service organizations do not have moneyed alumni or, happy patients or all the other kind of levers. And so there has to be an entrepreneurial piece. And the other thing is we're working on collective impact, right? So right now working on an initiative to bring little organizations together who are working on pieces of things and creating a fundraising campaign for them all that is thematic and can attract corporate and other kinds of contributions, which they wouldn't if it was just themselves. And so to just find pieces like that and ways of being able to work in economies of scale.
Yeah, that's really creative thinking. And I think, well, I guess the pandemic showed that nonprofits and charities can collaborate, and they found ways to collaborate during the pandemic that perhaps hadn't been explored before. So
Yeah,
there's
and they do. They're like everybody's there because they care about the cause and other things. It's just the incentives in the system do not incentivize collaboration, and every system is aligned to incentives, right? And so uh, and everything is a decision and a choice. So it's not, so the competitive nature of grants is by design. You could design it that it wasn't competitive. So you have organizations putting in all this time on grants and a fraction of them get supported. It's true in the private sector too. When you're bidding for business, you're going to get maybe 1 in 10, but the one that you get is going to be profitable and can resource the people that took the time doing the other nine, but you don't have that equivalency in the charitable sector. That you've spent all that time on this proposal, and the next proposal, if you do get it, is not going to recoup all this time because it's very projects focused, and you can have certain percentage that's for overhead, and so it's not it costs a lot for organizations to participate in submitting the grants, and it's competitive. And so it means if I get it, you don't. And that's a design in the system. It doesn't have to be like that. And that's why I always go up higher to like, okay, so we have $500 billion swishing around. There's, $1 trillion in that's going to be moved in terms of inheritance and whatever. What are we doing? What do we want to do? How does this work for us? How do we leverage the 500 billion that's already there because of mandatory taxation? How do we amplify that with our private efforts, and bring the challenges that each small organization is facing and just make them more visible? Because I think that there's a push, there's a pull factor that organizations who have professional fundraisers have, that smaller groups don't. That is not, it's invisible. That that unbalanced playing field is invisible. But I think as it becomes, so if we make it more visible, then I think that there'll be more foundations scouting organizations or using capital W's data to identify a particular way that their private donation can leverage other kinds of donations, being intentional in that way. Because right now players are making decisions kind of independent of each other, and I think creating visibility will make a more efficient system.
I really appreciate your thinking so creatively and uniquely, and I guess part of that opened your eyes was the kind of data that you were getting as well from your work with the T3010 and all those data points has assisted you in seeing things that perhaps are not easily seen without it. I wonder, as we wrap up, I mean, I wonder if you could provide some advice to nonprofits about how they should be thinking or working differently, or even being able to access that understanding and potentially engage in these alternative forms of that you've just described, either funding the capacity to fundraise or working collectively and working and raising visibility and doing that sort of work. I wonder if you could provide a little bit of advice around that.
Yeah, so right now, because it's an emergent field, it's very cause specific and organization specific. And I'm happy to speak with anybody directly about their own situation. What I would say is if there is a way that you have seen that there's efficiencies or amplification that can be done in your space, if you are in a space that people can have those kind of conversations together, you are really well positioned to be going to talk to a funder. Because as a charity, when I go in the door to talk to a funder, they're my one conversation a day, but they're having this conversation 25 times. And they're trying to fit it together in their own mind about how all these different groups that sound similar, what are the differences and what are they doing? So if there's a mechanism to collaborate and bring integrated asks, but again, that takes somebody to do that. It doesn't just fall out of the sky, but if that is there, that is something that's great. And I'm happy to have that conversation. And maybe Mary, you can share my my email, and I can share where these collective impact pieces are happening, and these new models of resourcing.
Well, I'll definitely be including information about capital W in our show notes and a link to your site. I really want to thank you, Kathryn. It's been really fascinating talking to you and learning about the analysis you were able to make with this incredible data treasure you have that seems so unique and so powerful to be
Can I
able
say
to
one
learn.
more thing? Yeah.
Sure. Yes, please do.
There's been a lot of talk about home and government, and I'd just like to put out the perspective that I don't think the sector should be asking that of government. I think government should be asking the sector if they would, how they can make that happen. The only finance minister in Canadian history that was toppled. It was toppled by a charity. There's $322 billion moving through the system. Most of it's coming from government. It's in their interest to have a visibility to the aggregate of that. And if we don't know ourselves as charities, if we're in a position where we're asking for a favor, this is a position that they're doing something that will, as a favor to us, it's still perpetuating that paradigm of that power imbalance. And I think that there's a lot to be said for reopening the conversation about this actually being a public-private partnership, and how do we have reverence and respect for the role that each is playing, and amplify the social outcomes that we're working towards.
Yeah, this perpetuating of the supplicant, is not a good look, and actually isn't a position of strength. And given the contributions that the not-for-profit and charitable sector make to our society, is a strength in and of itself that should, I think, can be a big player at any negotiating table. So, I really, again, enjoyed your analysis and really fascinating insights. And I'm really excited about following the kinds of creative ways that you're helping smaller nonprofits and charities find ways to replicate the kind of expertise that is available for the larger ones, and helping them create a much more sustainable future. So thank you for it's really been wonderful to learn of all of this, and helping nonprofits and charities across Canada to better navigate these rather uncertain times, and think of their fundraising strategies in a different way. Thanks for joining Charity Village.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you.